Hello, lovely students. So as you go through the process of designing your own labs, there's a lot of different variables that you might want to look at. And when you're looking at your dependent variables, the things that you can measure, one thing you may want to be measuring is color. Now, color is something we can see really easily, but it's actually kind of hard to quantify. And if we're doing an experiment, we want to find a way to figure out how much color something has. A good example is with the enzyme experiment, where we use guaiacol as an indicator for oxygen, because guaiacol reacts with oxygen, and when they react, it forms this dark brown color. The darker brown, the more oxygen, and that can tell us a little something about the system. When we're doing an experiment like that, the first way that we can quantify color is we can create a scale. So this is just arbitrary. We look at some different colors and we assign them a value. So if we see this one, we've got 1 all the way through 10. We looked at these different values and you can just match up your color to this one. We use this a lot with like pH indicators that'll turn color and you match them. Sometimes glucose indicators, you just match colors with the scale. Now that's a good way to quantify color if it works for your situation. For the guaiacol, I think it's actually kind of challenging to tell the difference. If I look here at 6 and I look at 7, to me those colors look really similar, so I know I have a really large margin of error. This is an example of the results that we got from the guaiacol experiment with the enzymes. So we put peroxidase in with these different pHs. This was pH 10, this was pH 3. I can tell that somewhere in the middle is where the guaiacol was reacting the most and turning that dark brown. So I can tell that's where my peroxidase enzyme was working the best. However, I can't really tell the difference between the 6 and the 5. I can't really tell the difference between the 7 and the 8. So it would be nice if there was an easier way to quantify those little differences in color. Luckily, there is. Dun 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 dun. We have a colorimeter. So a colorimeter is a tool that we have a chance to use that works with an interface with a computer. The idea of a colorimeter is kind of like this little diagram here at the bottom. You start with this light source. You have this beam of light that goes through a small slit. We know that the initial strength of the beam of the light, you send it through some sort of liquid, and a small amount of it will come out the other side. There's a detector that can see how much of that comes out the other side. And by seeing how much of that comes out, it tells us how much was absorbed. The clearer things are, the more it'll go through. The darker things are, the less it'll go through. So that's a way that we could tell the difference between even small values with the guaiacol or with any other color indicator. When we look at this, there's 2 different things that we can measure. The first thing is transmittance. So transmit means to go through, and so transmittance is the amount of light that penetrates, the amount of light that makes it through. So if I looked at this beam, that is the transmittance. The other thing I can measure is kind of inversely related, and that's the absorbance. So the absorbance would be the amount of light that actually gets, the amount of light that actually gets absorbed by the solution. Now these 2 things are not completely 100% related because there's this relationship between the absorbing ability, the distance traveled by the light, and the concentration of the solution. Concentration is the part that we want to look at, and so we've got this absorbing ability and distance left. The size of this little area is going to be the same, so we can ignore distance, and that absorbing ability is going to be this proportionality. There's this relationship that's been shown to be a law, it's called Beer law. Has to do with A, which is absorbance, is equal to K, which is some value of the absorbing ability of that solute, times C, which is the concentration. So we know that absorbance is related to concentration proportionally. So if I was trying to find the concentration of something like the brown color in the guaiacol, I can do it using absorbance. So if I can get a value for absorbance, that'll tell me a little something about the darkness of this color, which will help me in answering my questions that I have. Okay, so to set up this, we are going to use a system called Vernier. Vernier has a lot of different probes, and they interact with the computer in different ways. The one that we're going to use in this case is the colorimeter. To set up this probe, there's a bunch of stuff that we need. So you need this little green box. This is the little communicator. It's going to help communicate with the computer. We've got here a power source, we've got a USB cable, we've got our different probe, in this case, the colorimeter. So the first thing you want to do is you want to set up everything going through this little box. So first you need to plug it in to the wall. These things need power. When you plug it in, you're going to hear a little beeping sound like like that one, that will tell you that this thing is attached and has power. The next thing you want to do is you want to plug into the computer. There'll be a USB that goes from here directly to the USB drive in the computer. And then up in top, there's a couple of different channels. These have 4 different channels. I just like to use channel 1, and you can use that to connect through this little gray connector and then to your probe. So if we look at this part, got this gray connector, and then it connects to the probe itself. The colorimeter looks like this. When I'm looking at the colorimeter, I've got this knob up here that I can have different colors of light going through. I have this little door up here. This just swings open and swings back closed so I can put my samples inside of this little machine. Okay, so once you get this thing set up and plugged in, you have to go through a process of calibration. To do that, once you've plugged this thing in, you need to look on the desktop for this program called LoggerPro. Double click on that and it'll open up this program. LoggerPro interface will look like this. There's a couple of things you need to do with the LoggerPro interface. The first thing is you have to tell it what type of probe there is. So to do that, you go up to Experiment, you go to Setup Sensors, and you go to Show All Interfaces. So this is a little diagram of our little box here. I put this into channel 1, and so I need to click on channel 1. I'm going to choose my sensor. The sensor that I have in is the colorimeter. I'm just looking at this list. There's a bunch of different probes. We don't have them all, but we have some of these. So I'll click colorimeter on this one. I can see that it's getting a value from that, and that tells me, yep, I've got the right thing. I click identify. That beeping that you hear, that's saying, yep, it's identified, everything is talking, and that's what we want. So then we can close that. Now we'll see there's a couple values. Up here at the top, I've got this transmittance value and I've got this absorbance value. Once we're ready to get our data, those are the types of things that we're going to be writing down. There's also this box here where I can have it do some work for me. I can have different times. You can do transmittance and absorbance that way. And then I see at the bottom, there's this big transmittance thing. Before I collect any data though, I need to calibrate this. And so the way that I do that is I go up to Data, nope. I go to Experiment, go to Experiment, go to Calibrate, and I want to calibrate my colorimeter. Okay, so there's a couple things that you have to do to calibrate. First thing you have to say is yes, I want to calibrate it. When you're ready to calibrate, there's this knob at the top, and the first value, you're going to turn this knob to 0% transmittance. That's going to be no light going through. That's going to be the lowest value for the machine. And then after you've put in that value, you're going to put in an empty cuvette. Notice with these cuvettes, there's these little like ribbed sides and there's these blank sides. The ribbed sides is where you hold. The blank sides is the one that's going to be lined up with this line. That's where the light will go through. Then once you put this thing in, you're going to turn this knob up to the color of light that you want. We have a couple different options, green, red, and blue. It doesn't really matter which one you use, but it's always a good idea to choose a color other than the color of the solution. So if I was using a blue solution, I would want to use red. In this case, I'm going to be using a sort of reddish solution, so I'm going to use a blue color. Okay, let me show you what that'll look like, the two values that we'll get on the LoggerPro side of this thing. Okay, so once I'm at my LoggerPro, I am going to turn this thing down to 0% transmittance, and then I am going to get this value right here. This value, once it's stabilized, I just need to write it into this little box. I click Keep. Then I'm going to turn my knob up to the color of light that I want, and I'll see this value change. I need to wait until that value stabilizes, and then I need to put in that value. Hit Keep. Hit done, and my thing is calibrated for the amount of time that I'll do my experiment. Now the only thing that I have to do is swing this thing open, put in my different cuvette, close that thing back up, and it'll give me my values. So for example, if I was using a red cuvette like this, then I could swing this thing open, put it in the machine, close that thing back up, and you'll see these numbers up here. Those will be the ones I would want to write. This 0.151 if I was looking at transmittance, or this 2.297 if I was looking at absorbance. Again, this will help tell me concentration of these different things. Okay, last thing is just to make sure that when you're putting in your different samples, you're keeping the clear side lined up, you're keeping the cuvette lined up. All of your cuvettes, you should try to fill them up about 3/4 full. That is between like 2.2 and 3.5 milliliters. You don't want to fill it up any more or any less because it just doesn't work as well in the machine. So there's a couple things to keep in mind as you're going through this process of setting these things up. The best thing to do in LoggerPro is to play around with a couple of the functions and see any of the other stuff that you can do. Hopefully this helps.